Hi, this is Father Mark Boulos with the Bible as Literature podcast. Why do discussions about race in the United States always seem to widen the gap between neighbors? How do our assumptions about race cripple our ability to recognize oppression in unfamiliar places? Is racism the main issue, or is it symptomatic of a deeper human dysfunction? In the first episode of a 4-part series, Richard and I examine the problem of identity in the book of Ruth. As is to be expected, the Bible's wisdom on this subject will embarrass folks on both sides of the aisle.
You're listening to the Bible as Literature.
Hi, this is Father Mark Boulos.
And this is Dr. Richard Benton.
And you are listening to episode 89 of the Bible as Literature podcast. We have talked again and again on this show about the problem with assuming that the New Testament says something new. It doesn't. The New Testament simply takes something old and re-presents it to a broader audience.
Knowledge of the Bible and knowledge of the biblical text is enough to disabuse this notion. People make an assumption that Jesus is here to bring peace, so that when Jesus talks about a sword, people get into a tizzy because it doesn't jive. It's necessary to really look at the text, take the text seriously, and take the text as primary. And before one gets in a tizzy about the Bible disagreeing with you, get into a tizzy about you disagreeing with the Bible. If we begin with that presupposition, I think we're going to be in much safer shape.
This idea that there has been a progression in human civilization in terms of our humanity and our wisdom over time and improvement is a false assumption. It's a broken idea. One might look at, for example, Galatians and say, well, Paul talked about circumcision, but now we understand that it's about racism. But just last week, there was a black candidate who's part of the public discussion about race and culture and all of the different topics that impact the election season. We had a black candidate saying that a Muslim shouldn't be eligible to become president of the United States. So there's something dysfunctional about modern discussions of race. And our way of talking about race in the United States is not an enhancement of human wisdom. You could argue, actually, that it's the decay of wisdom. Because even before Paul, there were numerous texts in the Old Testament that didn't deal just with questions of race, but dealt primarily and fundamentally with the question of identity, the problem of identity, which encompasses race. It encompasses behavioral function. It encompasses every kind of othering that human beings do that proves to be destructive.
Ever since Abraham is welcomed with hospitality by the Hittites, we have this problem of identity, because identity usually lines up this group versus that group with the good group and the bad group. And when Abraham is working with this Hittite, the Hittite is more than generous to Abraham in offering him land.
It's really important to understand the deficiencies in modern ideology. I was fortunate yesterday to have lunch with a Palestinian intellectual from Bethlehem, and he was sharing with me an observation made by a famous poet, Mahmoud Darwish, that dialogues are problematic. That what Palestinians should be engaged in is not dialogue with the Israelis, but neighboring with the Israelis. Because when you have a dialogue with the Israelis, you have two identities facing off against each other. Everybody wants to do dialogues all the time. They're very impressed with this concept from Greek philosophy. But the Semitic tradition focuses on neighboring. Because when you neighbor someone, you actually behave correctly towards them. You take an interest in them and you engage with them on a familiar level, and identity no longer functions in that setting. Or neighboring should at least trump identity. It's easy to have an opinion about a Jewish person or a Palestinian person. It's much harder, as everyone knows, when you actually have a personal encounter with the other. You're forced to actually deal with the data of the other versus your platonic ideal of the other. All of this, though, is not something that's being discovered by modern ideology. It's something that we received from our ancient wisdom traditions that we constantly forget and constantly need to be reminded of. And today we wanted to talk about the book of Ruth because so much of what the New Testament is depends so heavily on the scandal of Ruth.
The problem in Ruth is that we have this Moabitess, and the Moabites are an historical enemy of the Israelites. And so we have a Moabite who's the best person in the whole story, who is willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of not her people, but for another people. And when you mentioned this idea of neighboring, this is something that I have blogged about, and how one has to learn how to become good neighbors with people, how one does have to open themselves up to others and make themselves vulnerable in order to learn and in order to become close to people, in order to understand the people around them. This is what Ruth is doing herself. So the problem that the book of Ruth is confronting is this idea of the good Israelite and the bad Gentile, because we're confronted with this person who is the good Moabitess, who sacrifices herself for Israel, and who is willing to give up everything for the sake of not only Israel, but also for helping a widow, which we should hear that with good biblical ears to understand that this is the top, or maybe even the main ethical call, which is to help the orphans and the widows. She is dealing with a widow and is willing to give up her livelihood in order to help out this widow. So the question of identity is put in tension by this book. Is it possible for the Gentile to be good? Is it possible for the Gentile to be better than us, better than the Israelites? What about the children of this good Moabitess? Does that person count as good based on the merits of her mother?
What makes a person an Israelite? Is it their bloodline? Is it their keeping of religious customs? Or is it their behavior?
Because this person is a Moabitess, she's not educated in Torah, so it can't even be out of obedience to the Lord's law, the Lord's teaching, because she can't have heard it. She hasn't even been in the land.
Well, and this is the deeper point I'm making about race in the United States. We've settled on categories of victims to such an extent that we can't see when a black man is being racist. We can't see when a Jewish person is being oppressive. We can't. The litmus test of our time, the test of whether or not someone really cares about race, is how they interpret the Middle East, how they interpret Islam, because so many people who are hung up with issues of gender, race, or color are completely blind, or at least ambivalent about the persecution of all types of different kinds of people, especially when the victimization of another group calls into question their ontological understanding of traditional categories of victim in the United States.
This is constantly changing. I think we need to be thinking about that, Father, because we, for example, have friends from Spain, and they moved to this country, and in Spain, people from Latin America tend to be of a lower socioeconomic class. When our friends moved here to the United States, they became close friends with a lot of Latinos on equal terms because of language, and as a result, the distinction between the socioeconomic classes that were in Spain then changed once they came to the U.S. Ontologically, nobody changed. Mexicans were from Mexico and Spaniards were from Spain. But once you move from Spain to here, the context changes everything. It's how does it function?
A progressive insisting that no, this category is a victim, and a conservative reacting to that saying, no, we're also victims too, both the progressive and the conservative in that scenario sound ignorant to my scriptural ears. It's like trying to insist that a stove is hot. No, stoves are hot. Well, my stove is cold, but my stove is hot. You're locked into a kind of self-imposed blindness or ignorance because you're just making an assumption about how something functions and assuming it always functions that way, and it's not true. And until we learn to start thinking in the functional category of other instead of the ontological category of our victim du jour, we're not only going to fail at trying to address the problem of racism, we're going to create new problems, because every ideology is a defensive reaction against another ideology. So it's very important that we set aside Western progressivism and look deep into our biblical roots to understand how we can address these modern problems. And I think the book of Ruth is a great starting point.
Right. The book of Ruth is understood in oversimplified terms as simply the description of a virtuous woman, and therefore women in our culture should imitate the virtue of this woman. And I think what you're saying, Father, and what we're discussing brings it to a much deeper level, that this has to do with insider and outsider and what it is to be obedient and what it means to be a correct person.
Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land. And I think it's important here right off the bat. It's not in the day of the king. It is in the period of time when the people of Judah are governed under the authority of the Torah, shepherded by judges who interpret God's instruction and who make sure that God's instruction is followed and applied in the land. There's no king. This is before David's line. So it was in that period that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah, that's my family's hometown, I'm very proud of that, a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. So anyone reading this is going to say this is before David, yet we're talking about the city of David and Judah, right? Because the person reading this, I mean, I know that people like to assume that these texts were fragments written at different periods and different times. We've said over and over again that someone reading this is reading it in context of the whole canon. So they know that Bethlehem is the city of David, even though this predates David in the narrative arc of the Bible. So someone from the city of David went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and 2 sons.
It starts off in Bethlehem and immediately moves outside of the land. This begins outside of the land of Israel, in the land of the enemies of Israel.
So they're leaving the city of David, going outside, and the first name you hear is very striking with that observation in mind. The name of the man was Elimelech, which means God is my king. So it's the time of the judges. You start in the city of David, and you leave the city of David and go outside to the land of the Moabites. And the name of the man who left is God is my king, meaning I don't need David, I don't need the city, I don't need Judah. It's a pattern that appears again and again. It undermines what has become in modern ideology the concept of nationalism or nation. Already in the ancient world, you have the book of Ruth undermining the concept of nation and king. And the name of his wife was Naomi, and Naomi could be from Naaman in Hebrew, which is related to the word grace, Naamat, which could mean pleasant or graceful. And the names of his 2 sons contrast and conflict with these names. So the first one was Mahlon, which implies sickness or suffering. The name of his second child, his second son, was Kilian, which could mean failing or annihilation. Both were Ephrathites of Bethlehem and Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then God is my king, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, which again could imply gloom or darkness, and the name of the other Ruth. Now the name Ruth is interesting. So far we've had names that imply destruction, sickness, suffering, aside from the names of the parents. We're not doing so well with the children who were born in exile in the land of the Moabites. But then there's this name Ruth. What's going on with the name Ruth?
Well, it's difficult to understand exactly what this name Ruth might mean. Oftentimes when people are trying to understand the etymology of a name, they have to make some leaps in logic. Sometimes people want to put an extra consonant in root, which is the Hebrew. You can put an ein in there, which would mean it has something to do with friendship, or an aleph in there, which can mean something about seeing or something like that, the one who is seen maybe. So some people will do that in order to come up with an etymology for the name, but it's very difficult to come up with a clear etymology. You know, when I was doing my PhD, as they always say, be suspicious of the dictionary, because people do have to make presuppositions even when they are writing the dictionary, even when they're giving you a meaning of the word. There are leaps in logic they have to make. I think that both of those etymologies of this word have some validity to them, but I think that this one's much more difficult to tell than, say, Elimelech, which is very clear, my God is king, and Naomi very clearly means my pleasantness, but Ruth and Orpah are much more difficult to etymologize.
You have the facts of the grammar. And when the facts of the grammar are inconclusive, your only other option is to do a word study. How is this term used in the text here or elsewhere? Now, in the case of Ruth, You pointed out to me earlier as a linguist that Ruth doesn't have a consonantal root, which is what makes it so challenging, especially challenging. But we have to assume, as students of the Bible who are committed to the Bible as literature, we have to assume that the author who's been so purposeful about the choice of names potentially has a purpose in this name Ruth. So as we read through over the next 4 podcasts and try to understand what's going on in this text, I think we need to keep coming back to the question of what the best interpretation of Ruth's name should be based on the narrative.
Yeah, I agree.
So they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband.
They took Moabites as wives. This is a no-no. You're not supposed to marry Moabites. Israelites are not supposed to marry Gentiles, because they might distract them, they might cause them to follow after other gods. This is what we read in the Torah. So in being married to these people, they're already on shaky ground.
Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. When her husband was alive, she was married to a man whose name proclaimed, "God is my king." He left Bethlehem, and she followed him into the wilderness. And then she heard that God, the same God, had moved back to Judah to bless the people, so she went back to Judah. So there's something special here about Naomi, that she's just at ease. She has no difficulty whatsoever going where God goes.
This story always reminded me a little bit of Jacob and going down to Egypt where there was food, and then afterwards they took their trip back to the land. In this way, Moab always sounds a little bit like Egypt to me. And unlike Jacob, they're bringing back Egyptians to come live in the land. They're bringing the enemy back to live in the land. So the question is, what kind of havoc are these people going to raise? Like people are concerned about the refugees coming into Europe. How many terrorists are going to be hiding among those people? We need to be suspicious of them. Do we need to be suspicious of Orpah and Ruth as they infiltrate the land of Israel as economic refugees looking for food? We'll have to see what happens.
And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." Respect for the dead, and this becomes prominent in Roman culture, is foundation of piety, because it's associated with elders, those who went before you. So you've shown respect to the dead, and you've shown respect to me, your elder. May the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept.
So this is Moabites caring for the Israelite widow in helping her travel back to her land, back to her people. They put themselves in potential danger, 3 women traveling by themselves, in order to make sure that their mother-in-law is taken care of.
And they said to her, "No, but we will surely return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands?" So here Naomi is concerned about their economic well-being. So Naomi is being correct, but it raises the question, why can't they go back to Judah, which is supposedly governed by God's teaching, without fear of being abandoned? I think already Judah is failing a test here. Why can't these Moabite women be as welcomed and embraced in Judah as Naomi was embraced in Moab? It's unclear at this point whether Naomi is endorsing the class system in Judah that looks down upon the other from Moab, or whether she herself is powerless to overcome it. But the point is, where her daughters showed hospitality to her in a strange land, her daughters-in-law, she's not able to return the favor.
Right. What she's assuming is that, okay, you're young women, you have no children, you need to get married. You're a Moabite, I'm a Judahite, we find ourselves in Judah. You need to get married. You should not get married here, or you cannot get married here. So you should go back to Moab so that you can have husbands. Whatever reason she has in her mind that a Moabite woman can't get married in Judah is motivating her to tell her daughters-in-law to leave.
But what's beautiful about this story, comes in the next verse, and they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Ruth and Orpah are not judging Naomi. They love her, and that's it. Then she said, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. So here, Ruth doesn't judge Naomi, understands that going back to Judah could result in her homelessness and abandonment. But she doesn't want to go back to the other gods like her sister. She wants to remain faithful to Naomi, whom she loves. She's committed to this relationship, which is really important in the context of God's teaching. A relationship is not something you can transgress with or without a certificate. And she's willing to throw all caution to the wind and simply commit herself to the love of neighbor and to the love of God. This is the DNA of the New Testament.
It's important to recognize that here Ruth is choosing to live outside of her land. She chooses to turn her back on her family in order to help this widow. She's willing to leave the place where she knows she's only lived in Moab up to this point. She leaves her land, she leaves her people for the sake of caring for a widow, and even declares the Lord as her God in order to do so.
And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. Because if Ruth is willing to take on all this risk, and if Ruth is pledging her life to the love of neighbor and to the service of the God of Elimelech, what can Naomi say? She's already said, I can't help you because I can't provide a husband for you. What more can she say? This is what a real relationship is. This is what real neighboring looks like. And this is what real community is. So you have this powerful example in the relationship between these two women. So they both went until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? She said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. So now her name is no longer pleasantness, it's bitterness. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest.
So I'm going to argue with one translation here. I'm going to say it's not who returned from the land of Moab, because she turned from the land of Moab. This is a play in Hebrew, shuv, which is also used for repentance. It's also for loyalty. You turn to be loyal to somebody. So disloyalty, loyalty, it's all turning. Which direction are you facing? The Moabitess Ruth decided to turn towards the Lord, to turn towards Naomi, and to care for the widow in obedience to this new God, her Lord, the Lord of the Israelites.
There's this interesting inversion of geography, because now Naomi is going back to Judah. You would think that she's blessed, but she's now entering into the land of Judah, and she's bitter, she's cursed. What is going on there? Why is she claiming that God has afflicted her?
Because she lost her husband, she's lost her children, and she has nothing left. All she has is this daughter-in-law, a Moabitess, in tow.
So we'll leave it there until next time. Thanks, Richard. We'll look forward to our continued discussion of the book of Ruth. Have a great week.
Thank you, you too, Father.
You've just heard the Bible.
Hi, this is Father Mark Boulos with the Bible as Literature podcast. How is the content of Ruth reflected in the teaching of St. Paul and in the gospel narratives? Why, in Ruth, does it matter who is whose relative and who is connected to whom? Why do Richard and I make such a big deal out of biblical names? Why does Ruth prostrate herself in front of a man? Isn't she the one making all the big sacrifices to support Naomi? Shouldn't everyone bow to her? Who is this mighty Boaz anyway? Is power always evil? Only for those whose mind can't get past the person to see God's function in operation. Richard and I discuss Ruth chapter 2.
You're listening to the Bible as literature.
Hi, this is Father Mark Boulos.
And this is Dr. Richard Benton.
And you are listening to episode 90 of the Bible as Literature podcast. We move on today to chapter 2 of the book of Ruth. We have a Moabitess in the land of Judah. Her husband died. Her mother-in-law's husband died. They have no source of income, not even for the widow of Judah, let alone the Moabitess.
One of the tragedies of having your sons die is that you didn't have anyone who could inherit the substance of their father. Their father died and the children died. There's no one to pass the inheritance along to. And so this puts Naomi in a pickle. And the other side of this is that Ruth is coming from Moab, so she has no rights to the land of Judah because she's a foreigner. She has no family there. The only inheritance she might have would be her father's or her husband's. And since she has no father, she abandoned him. She has no husband, he died. She has no rights to anything. And so the way that one would gain a living would be from land, but she has no rights to any land. And so I want our listeners to understand that the story is focusing on this pickle that Naomi and Ruth are in, because we don't really hear it in that way. We think, oh, this person died, that's too bad, but at least the person can go and access their bank account. There's no bank account. There's just the land, but the land is in limbo right now. Nobody owns it.
And please don't hear this story in terms of modern ideological dysfunction surrounding gender. We know that it's unjust from the perspective of Western civil society that when a woman dies, she doesn't have access to wealth. She's completely at the mercy of the neighborhood, so to speak. We know that from our perspective, this is unjust. But that doesn't make this story about civil rights or women's rights, because this story is actually pressuring the addressee to feel this burden. It's not about whether or not women should be in this situation. It's about whether anyone should ever be abandoned in a land governed by God's instruction.
The other side is important because one can say, oh, these poor women, they have no agency, they don't get to decide, they don't get to have money. And I think that the opposite is true, because already we talked in chapter 1 about how Ruth took it upon herself to take care of the widow, her mother-in-law. So even without the agency that maybe a modern Western woman might have, she still found agency so that she could take care of somebody else. And I think this is central, that no matter what state she's in, a foreigner with no substance whatsoever, she says to her mother-in-law, I'm sticking with you and I'm taking care of you, no matter what. Now, in the United States, we would have similar problems. I mean, let's say that somebody owns a house and they die and their children die. Who owns the house? That would be a big legal problem here in the U.S. too, and this house would sit abandoned for a while. The only thing is that house isn't a source of income for somebody, whereas a piece of land in the ancient world was a source of income. So you have a source of income just lying fallow. What's going to come of it?
Blessed is our God who brings forth bread from the earth. It's a big thing. You're in the house of bread in Hebrew, Beit Lehem. In Arabic it's meat, but in Hebrew it's the house of bread. The land brings forth bread. The land belongs to God. If you aren't able to share in a portion of the land, you are not sharing in the bread of the land, and the milk and the honey and the fat, and all of these expressions of the fruit that is produced by the earth. So it's a very serious matter. It's not about possession in the modern sense where you have something of monetary value that you claim and you can sell and you want to get interest on it. You actually are connected to the land in a very personal way.
The bread comes directly from there. Your food is produced directly from those goods that come from the land.
It's like scientists who talk about how our immunity has been crippled because we wear shoes, because we don't put our feet in the dirt. Even though we're talking about civilization and the city of Bethlehem in the land of Judah, these are still people who planted their feet in the ground. They were very much connected to the life and the cycles of the land in an agrarian setting. It's always important to remember that as we work through these texts. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now, once again, we have the introduction of another name.
It looks like it's from the root azaz, which means strength.
Like in Arabic, aziz, which means mighty or strong.
The be that comes before it means by means of. So you can understand this word as meaning be'uz, or Boaz, meaning with strength. Mm-hmm. So it's a story about how he is using his substance. Boaz is using his substance in order to benefit a widow in his community.
But what's interesting about the usage of this word, azaz, especially in the Psalms, and I'm thinking specifically of Psalm 8, it references God's strength. Right? So we're talking about the land which belongs to God, and this is implicit in Scripture, even if it's not stated explicitly here in chapter 2. And we're talking about his kinsman, Elimelech, whose name means my God is king. So his reference is God. And now you have another actor who's closely related to him, whose name means strength, but if you do a word study in the Psalter, it perhaps is pertaining to the strength of God, not the strength of the character in the story, which sets him up potentially as a positive function in the narrative. We'll have to see how this plays out.
Right. I want to also comment on another word that we have here translated as a kinsman. This comes from the word yada, which means to know. So it's like a known person. If I had to translate it more directly, it would be like an acquaintance. Naomi had an acquaintance of her husband, a man of great wealth. It's hard to know exactly like what the relationship is just from this verse. We'll find out more later, but I don't want it to be confused. It doesn't necessarily mean right off the bat that they're blood relatives.
Depending on what that relationship turns out to be, it could have significant impact on the passing on or access to the inheritance of Elimelech.
Yeah.
That's why it's very important.
So it kind of sets up a tension in this first verse, that there's this person and who knew her husband, and then we have to understand a Middle Eastern context, because this doesn't happen in a Western context. When I was in Morocco, there was someone I was looking for, and I found somebody who knew who he was, and he showed me, and he drove me over there. We spent some time together, and they were laughing stuff and telling stories, and afterwards the one left, and I asked, oh, how do you guys know each other? And he said, I think he's a relative or something. Nobody talks like this in the West. So you have to understand, in the Middle Eastern context, understanding these relatives, they're an important part of life, but they aren't the same kind of relatives versus friends. There's a much more porous border between friends and relatives in the ancient world.
And there's a different dynamic also, because in the modern West, because we're very individualistic, we think about what I have and I own and I possess, what you have and you own and you do in your life and my life. But even in the modern Middle East, when you're networking, Arabs are extremely networked. If you find out someone that you're networked with has come into good fortune, it's not presumptuous to assume that that fortune would be shared with you. You know, so hearing that there's a potential relative of your deceased husband, it's a sign of hope at the opening of the chapter. In this country, people would be very covetous if they were to come into a large amount of money. But as I say, in Semitic cultures, I mean, they have their own problem with greed and covetousness, obviously, but it's socially expected that people would share. Now, sometimes that can come off as entitlement, but very often it functions as community and fellowship and mutuality. I mean, these are the ancient mechanisms with deep, deep cultural roots, in my view, heavily influenced by the biblical tradition in the Near East, where the society, in the absence of civil laws that impose certain safety mechanisms for protected classes, it was just assumed that people would be responsible. Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter.
Ruth came to the land because she needed to take care of her mother-in-law. Mm-hmm. And she said, hey, I'm going to go find some people who are out gleaning, and I'm going to go and get us some food, because, you know, they don't have money, there's no shop. So you go and you find a field where people are working, and she says, I'll go, and maybe someone will be nice to me and let me go and glean, you know, whatever's left over after they're done harvesting in the field, and that way we'll have some food.
So two women, all they have is each other in a society of men, and they're hoping for the best, essentially.
And, I mean, it's so strong to realize that Ruth left her family and her land in order to live this life, where I'll go and see if someone is nice and will let me go and take some of their grain.
It's a beautiful love story, and not just in the romantic sense about Ruth and Boaz going through courtship, or the tragedy of the loss of Elimelech and so forth. It's about the love of a mother and a daughter, the bonds that break down the borders between societies. It's beautiful. So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family. So now we know for a fact he's of the same family. As addressees of the story, we now understand that this truly is a sign of hope for these two women. It's like winning the lottery, essentially, in the ancient world, that something like this would happen.
But we know this. We have to wait to see if Ruth finds out or how she might find out.
Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "May the Lord be with you." And they said to him, "May the Lord bless you." So he comes from the land of bread with the blessings of the Lord, wielding or bearing the strength of the Lord in his name. Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" The servant in charge of the reapers replied, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." And it's important here that we are not referring to her in the story as Mara. We are referring to her as Naomi, which means even though she, at the end of chapter 1, was in mourning, she's still referred to by the writer as the one who is pleasant, whose name means pleasantness but could also pertain to grace, which could say something about what's happening here. This is grace upon grace. Just as Naomi was blessed with the grace of Ruth's love and commitment, it could also imply that now Naomi will encounter grace again in the generosity of God towards her husband's household in the person of Boaz. And she said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids." So he's saying, look, I want you to stay with me, to stay with my group, with my servants.
And he's protecting her. I mean, having a lone woman out in the fields where it's a man's world and there's nobody around, it's a very vulnerable spot for her. She's vulnerable as a Moabitess because if the servants know that she's a Moabitess, they know there's no one to protect her. There is no clan to protect her if she's treated unjustly. So she's in a very vulnerable position. So what Boaz does is he surrounds her with his maids. He protects her with women in order to make sure that she stays safe, but also says, stay here and you'll be able to be taken care of.
Think of it this way. In the modern West, you know you're okay psychologically if you get a good job with a great company. In the ancient Near East, you know you're okay if you have family. And to a large extent, that's still true in the old world. The family is the safety net. So when you don't have family, it's a big issue.
Not only that, she came in order to be the safety net for somebody else. So not only is she vulnerable, but when she is vulnerable, Naomi is also vulnerable.
Right. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. This could mean not to bother you. It could mean also that no one's allowed to claim any sexual rights. No one's allowed to touch you sexually or to disturb you in any way. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw, meaning you get to drink from the same water as everybody else as though you're one of us. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor?" So again, I mentioned earlier this issue of grace. It's a different Hebrew word here. It's not namet, it's hen.
This word commonly appears in this phrase, to find favor in somebody's sight. And you get it in the Psalms where the psalmist is addressing God. To find favor in someone's sight it means that they show favor to you. So you say, why have you shown favor to me? It's a way of humbling yourself before someone who has power over you in a situation.
You're in a position of helplessness and someone is showing favor. Someone is going to get you out of your situation simply by fiat. And this is exactly the power that Boaz is exercising, which reflects the function of the biblical God. Dr. Nikolai Roddy pointed out that in the Old Testament, sometimes characters who you see as just human beings in the story take on the function of the biblical God, which is why I think the name Boaz is very important. Because if it does in fact reflect the might of God, that now God is showing favor.
Although it is odd to see in the Old Testament a rich man who seems to be a good guy. It's much easier for Boaz to be a nice guy than it is for Ruth to be a nice lady. And Ruth has sacrificed so much for her family, her in-laws, that Boaz is never even going to be able to sacrifice. When Jesus talks about the widow's mites she gave out of her poverty, Ruth had nothing and offered it all to her mother-in-law, whereas all Boaz has to offer is, the scraps left over after his servants have gleaned.
Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know." He's speaking in judgment. It has the feel of a scene where someone has suffered much and suddenly the king appears and simply, again, by fiat says, "You know what? You're not invisible. Your plight has not gone unnoticed. And now I'm going to relieve you of your burden." It's justice. It's the most beautiful kind of justice. It's like someone who's been suffering and struggling and no one sees and no one appreciates and no one acknowledges, and then someone with power acknowledges. Again, in a Western context, we tend to think of power in ontological terms, that power is evil. But this isn't what St. Paul is saying. He's saying power wielded by human beings is evil. Power wielded by God's commandment is beautiful.
And Boaz is following the commandment precisely because the reason why in Deuteronomy it says you should leave the corners of your field is for the widow and the orphan. And who do we have here? We have Ruth. What is Ruth? She's a widow and an orphan, both. So Boaz is following the commandments, and this is what's significant, and that's why the benediction that he gives in the next verse, "May the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge."
This proves my exegesis, because he himself is explicitly saying, it's not I, Boaz, who is blessing you. It's the Lord, implicitly, whose instruction guides my step, and whose Torah is my might. It is he who is coming now to save you. I'm just his vessel doing his command.
And Ruth is the obedient one to the Lord's teaching, seeking protection under the Lord.
So when she fell prostrate in front of Boaz, it was no joke. It's the function of the prostitute or the thief in the New Testament. It's the same function. You fall prostrate before Jesus simply because you have no other choice, not because you're better than the Pharisee. The only difference between a Pharisee and the prostitute is that the Pharisee has options. The prostitute doesn't. The prostitute didn't choose to be a Moabitess. She just is a Moabitess. And this is what makes Ruth so beautiful. She doesn't hesitate. She knows that she owes everything to this character in the story. She knows she's fully dependent. She doesn't say, "Should I bow down before a man? He should give me." She never claims she was faithful to anybody or that she was faithful to the household of Elimelech or any of this nonsense. She just falls prostrate. Beautiful. Classic. You can see how, once again, the Pauline school draws on these paradigms and these archetypes all over the place. Then she said, "I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." Notice, you are showing me grace. You are inviting me into the household and treating me as though I'm a member of the household, even though I'm not a member of the household. This is exactly the position the gospel wants to put you in. And that's why the gospel is always rejected by the faithful, those who call themselves faithful, because they believe they're on the inside with Boaz. But the gospel can only function when you put yourself on the outside with Ruth, because then you realize the only reason you're here is because God saw you in your misery and showed mercy on you. Such a powerful story. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here, that you may eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left. So she's sharing in the table fellowship within his household. When she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servant, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her."
There's dignity that she is owed. Boaz is really being tough on his servants, saying you're to treat her well at every turn. Like, he uses his authority to make sure that the people of his household treat her correctly, and uses his household to make sure that she, Ruth, is able to participate fully.
Which means that his household, which is the paradigm for Israel and therefore the paradigm for the church, is not for the enjoyment of the household. This is the anti-ecclesiology of Ruth. The church is not your church for your enjoyment or for your safety or comfort. You are one of the slaves in the household, and the master wants you as a slave who's already here to look after the outsider who's on the edges of the community. Once again, it's the insider-outsider paradigm. It's a big deal.
And the leftover of the field are the wages from the Lord to this person.
In the first gospel I read as a priest, after I was ordained, the first liturgy I served, was the beautiful story where the woman told Jesus, "Even the dogs, sir, eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." We're talking about Ruth. That's exactly what's happening here. Ruth is putting herself in the position of the Gentile dog, and God is lifting her up. Also, you shall purposely pull out for her some grain from the bundles and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. It's reminiscent of the corner of the field in the Torah, the beard, so to speak. You were saying this earlier, that the extra that we would save for those in need, we're going to make sure that she has access to it.
And if you let a little bit extra fall on the ground while you're reaping, that's fine too.
It's grace upon grace. So the pleasantness of Naomi and the favor of the might of the Lord in Boaz is being poured on hyperbolically in chapter 2. So she gleaned in the field until evening, then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. That's just a measurement. And she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also took it out and gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied. So everyone got to eat, and there was still left over. Again, this kind of language appears in the story of Jesus feeding the multitudes in the New Testament. There's always extra. When the Lord is the one providing the bread, there's always enough to go around and then some. So why are the people of Judah coveting the bread? Why covet it? Why not just give it away?
The only reason you would have to covet it is if the people in your place do not follow Torah like Boaz does. When people follow Torah, there are no poor people. Everyone is fed and everyone is satisfied. When somebody does not follow Torah, that's when you have poor people, and that's where you have hungry people.
A Westerner would look at the presumption of a Near Easterner that a relative's fortune or a neighbor's fortune is their fortune. We would look at that as entitlement, but in its proper context, it's understood as blessing and hope and fellowship, because this is what the Torah demands, that you share. Why shouldn't my good fortune be your good fortune? Why would we even discuss it? It should be an impulse. You win the lottery, everybody wins the lottery. This is lost, and this is why we're going to keep having school shootings every week, because no one is looking to see the needs of their neighbor. And so a kid who's feeling lonely or sad, who in a normal, healthy society would have people look in on him and talk to him and encourage him, is left alone in his room to play with the internet and look up all these weird ideologies and get more angry and feel more lonely and sad. Or maybe he's just evil and disturbed, not lonely and sad, but still no one's checking in on him because everyone's an individual, and then we're shocked that everything's falling apart. So it's important for people to contextualize even our current struggles in this culture and contrast how we relate to each other or don't relate to each other with the abundant generosity that is presented and proposed by this story. A story that has had huge impact on the way people have lived for centuries.
Her mother-in-law then said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz."
Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and the dead," meaning that the generosity of the Lord honors not only Elimelech, but his sons who passed on, because God is adopting the family, and God is now the husband and the provider in the family. And this is an honor to those who have gone before these women. Again, Naomi said to her, and this is the beautiful part where you win the lottery, right? It's like that movie about this Irish town where somebody wins the lottery and they passed away, but the whole town conspires to get the money and then share it. You know, the movie Waking Ned Devine. That's biblical. It's even more beautiful that the man who won the lottery is dead. Again, Naomi said to her, "The man is our relative." It's like saying, can you believe it? The man is our relative. He's one of our closest relatives.
So the word for relative, the first one, is karov, which means someone close. So before we knew it was somebody who was known, but now we find out it's someone who's close. But then when he says he is one of our closest relatives, this is more interesting because this comes from the root ga'al, so he's a goel. A ga'al is someone who redeems somebody. So what she is saying is this person is capable of redeeming the property and therefore receiving the inheritance. So Naomi is happy that Ruth is getting along well with someone who's not just known, but who's a close person, meaning a relative, and so is legally able to inherit Elimelech's estate. And if Elimelech's estate goes to Boaz, fine, at least somebody gets to use it. But if Ruth is in that household, then Ruth gets to benefit from it in addition. So it's double. Not only is Elimelech redeemed so that someone then can inherit his substance, Ruth can also benefit from it, and by extension then Naomi too. So it can be the happy ending they were looking for.
It would be interesting in another podcast to explore the potential connection between the term exagorazo in Galatians vis-a-vis the Septuagint to this example of redeem. In Galatians, it refers to obviously redeeming from slavery. But it's something similar here because these women are effectively slaves because they have no rights. Then Ruth the Moabitess said, "Furthermore, he said to me, you should stay close to my servants until they have finished all my harvest." Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his maids so that others do not fall upon you in another field." So she stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
Her honor is still being protected. Naomi says, good, stay with the maids. As long as you're with the maids, the men are not going to mess with you, because she's very vulnerable. I mean, as a foreigner, as an outsider, and everybody knows, Boaz asked the first random person, "Who's that lady?" And oh yeah, don't you know Naomi brought back this Moabitess? So everyone knew. So, stay in this field where you're being protected. Don't go wander into another field, because who knows what could happen to you. And what's more important is that Ruth still remained part of Naomi's household, a household of two, and that meant that whatever she was being able to glean, she was able to provide for her mother-in-law. So what Ruth said she would do by leaving her family and staying with her mother-in-law, she continued to do, and her good fortune, like you were saying with the lottery ticket, is Naomi's good fortune.
It's beautiful, and the best part is you can't even say that it's a woman in distress being rescued by a man, because it's the Lord who's rescuing Ruth and Naomi. Thanks very much, Dr. Benton.
Thank you, Father.
Looking forward to chapter 3 next week. Take care.
You've just heard the
Each week, the Bible as Literature podcast brings you in-depth discussion of the biblical text in a format short enough for your morning commute, but long enough to be substantive, posing difficult questions meant to keep you engaged. If you value this work, please consider donating as little as 25 cents per episode. That's just $1 per month. To learn more, please visit patreon.com/Bible. That's patreon.com/Bible. Thank you.
Hi, this is Father Mark Boulos with the Bible as Literature podcast. At your right hand stood the Queen in vesture of gold. Hear, O daughter, and see, and incline your ear. The rich among the people shall entreat your favor, and the king shall greatly desire your beauty, for he is your Lord, and you shall worship him.
You're listening to the Bible as Literature.
Hi, this is Father Mark Boulos.
And this is Dr. Richard Benton.
And you are listening to episode 91 of the Bible as Literature podcast. We have some interesting questions from our listening audience from last week's episode. I think they're worth calling out before we dig into chapter 3 today.
One of the questions was about Elimelech and whether he was betraying the covenant by moving to Moab and then allowing his sons to marry foreign women. Because, with a famine occurring in the land, we have to assume the judgment of the Lord. By going to Moab, he's moving away from the judgment of the Lord, avoiding the judgment of the Lord.
This is an unresolved tension from our last session, and it boils down to, do we understand it in an Ezekielian context, or do we understand it, for example, against the backdrop of Hosea and the minor prophets? I think in Ezekiel, the movement of God is initiated by God himself.
In Hosea, the problem is that when the wife no longer gets what she wants from this god, she goes to another god. And the god is always the god of another land. She goes after these gods in order to get grain. Oh, but now they're not providing enough grain. I'll go back to my first husband, and it's harlotry.
I think the point is that in the end, we're opting to read this in context of Hosea, and it's not a multiple choice option. I think we're looking at the actual technical imagery in the story and realizing that this is a negative metaphor.
And one of the problems about allowing your children to marry foreign wives, this is warned against in the Torah, is because the foreign wives will force them or convince them to betray God and to become unfaithful to their God. The irony is that whereas Elimelech and the children died, so maybe it could be cursed. The fact that Naomi comes back and says she's Mara because she's bitter, there is some curse there. But the irony is that in this whole entire story, the Moabite is the one that's most faithful. So it undermines even the Torah itself that says, don't go marrying Moabites because they're going to make you unfaithful. Actually, these Moabites are more faithful than the Israelites they married.
It doesn't undermine the Torah. That's not how I would phrase it. It demonstrates on the one hand that Elimelech cannot keep the Torah, and even though he doesn't keep the Torah, even though he leaves the land, and even though his sons shouldn't marry foreigners, it doesn't mean that God has abandoned him, and it doesn't mean that the Judahite is better than the Moabite.
I think this book is wonderful in the way that it sets up the tension between the good of the outsider and the tepidness of the insider.
So, the second question, can Boaz be seen as a clever opportunist? I would come down very strongly in the negative category here. There's no evidence in the text whatsoever that Boaz is an opportunist.
So what Boaz does is he sees that there is this unattached woman who has the right to some property, and as we'll see in this chapter, there's discussions about marrying her, and he would benefit from marrying her. So there is a case that one could make that he has his eye on her property or something. But the thing that comes out to me when I read the text is the way that he, every step of the way, acts correctly. For example, the fact that Boaz has to make sure that she's protected. Why is this the case? On the one hand, you could say maybe there's anger towards the foreigner and he wants to claim what she has. The other side would be that she's an unattached woman and therefore she's just anyone's for the taking. The discussion of the property that she has is not primary in this discussion, but what's really primary to me is that Boaz at every turn, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about chapter 3, really does the right thing.
I think that's clear, and I think when someone is following Torah, we're not really in a position to judge their intention unless the text judges their intention for us.
Judging his intentions when his actions are all correct, my take is that we would judge him for what he does, and what he does is precisely according to Torah. He takes care of the widow and the orphan. If he has the wrong reasons for taking care of the widow and the orphan...
It's immaterial. You're judged by the outcome of your actions. You're judged by whether you follow the commandment and whether or not it bears fruit. So if you have rotten intentions, but you do the right thing and it produces a good outcome, that probably is difficult for Sunday school teachers, ethicists, philosophers, and theologians, but for God it's just fine. Man is blind in this regard. You can't see a person's intentions or judge a person's intentions. You can only look at the outcome, and ultimately That's why God is the only judge, because he's the only one who can really see the ultimate outcome of everything. Anyways, great questions, especially this point about Elimelech. That was really helpful feedback, and we all learn from the text as we work through this material.
I'm really thankful for the listener feedback.
Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? Now, is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maids you were? Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight. Wash yourself, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking." So she's telling her daughter, it's time to look your best, and let me give you some pointers here on how to court this man.
Naomi here has a plan for her daughter-in-law to get married, but also this notion of Gaal that we talked about in last week's episode, which is being a relative and being a redeemer, meaning the one who can take possession of the inheritance. By marrying this man, the inheritance stays within the family, and it all will be good with both Naomi and with Ruth if this marriage were to happen.
It shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go over and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do. So this is a pretty provocative verse. Find out where he goes to bed, hop into bed with him, and uncover, presumably, his genitals. People have argued that feet are a euphemism for genitals. That certainly seems to work very clearly with this text. But whether we're talking about feet or genitals, we're talking about sex here in verse 4.
When she's looking her best and he's had something to drink and she's crawling into bed with him, whether it's feet or genitals, that's pretty much going to end up in the same place.
And it's almost a little bit snarky. So you get into bed with a man looking your best and you uncover him, and then he'll tell you what to do.
Let what happens happen.
Right? It's kind of like when parents who really can't deal with speaking plainly with their children about sexuality just say, well, you'll know what to do when the time comes. She said to her, "All that you say I will do." So she's being obedient here, which is characteristic of Ruth. So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law had commanded her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry. So, to make things more interesting, not only is a well-dressed, presumably beautiful girl going to enter into his bed and expose him for intimacy, but now he's had a little bit to drink.
Exactly.
So we know where this is going. He went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain, and she came secretly and uncovered his feet and lay down.
Now, one thing I think is important to notice, too, here is that Naomi mentioned do it where no one can see you, and Ruth waited till there was no one around to go and approach him. So there is an element of secrecy here because she's a foreign woman, and any woman who is just going into men's bedrooms after they're drunk in the middle of the night looking good is suspicious. But as a foreigner, she's already especially vulnerable. And so doing this secretly is important because there are other things that are happening in the background that she doesn't want to ruin.
Propriety is always a central issue in courtship, in sexuality, in terms of protecting the honor of women or the honor of, in this case, a father figure, Boaz. All of these tensions are at play here. Even now, no one wants to talk about being rejected. People don't want to open themselves up to another person, be rejected, and then have that publicly put on display. They don't want the details of their sexual lives exposed.
They don't want other people to make assumptions about motivations or something like that.
Or to be put in a position of weakness, or even in our culture, a position of shame.
Right.
There is still shame associated with sexuality. So, I mean, it's really not a stretch even for the modern Westerner to understand why propriety is in order here. It happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and bent forward, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative."
Spreading your covering is an expression for protecting or even marrying. This is used in Ezekiel 16 when the girl becomes old enough, the Lord then marries her, the girl Israel, when she's old enough, then spreads his clothing over her, and then he marries her.
This is really hard for people to understand in our culture because we are very uncomfortable with authority, let alone authority and power exercised by a male authority figure. A Westerner hearing this is going to be suspicious of Boaz right out of the gate because we're now programmed to be suspicious. But he's fulfilling a social responsibility. This is not coercive sexuality. He didn't ask for it. She's asking, and it's not about sex. It's about the possibility of him taking on responsibility for her.
As a husband.
As a husband. It's covenantal. And actually, the point that was made earlier about the potential of a broken covenant when Elimelech left the land, this could be seen in a way as undoing that break with Bethlehem. And again, the irony, and this is the difficulty of these texts, and when people try to be too black and white, you end up with fundamentalism. The fact that leaving Bethlehem again was trying to escape the judgment of your true husband, the Lord, does not mean that there's a problem with the Moabites. This is really a difficult nuance for people to grasp, and as if to really rub that in your face. I caused you to stumble by starving you. You stumbled in the land of the Moabites, and then out of your stumbling, not only did I show you that you were not better than the Moabites, but I undid the damage by creating this union between a Judahite and a Moabitess.
It's a strong endorsement of the foreigner who does the correct thing.
Yes. Then he said, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich." He's saying, you're not a harlot.
Not only that, she is going after a man to marry that's not going to just be titillating for her, but someone who's going to help her mother-in-law, because this way it keeps her mother-in-law's substance in the family by marrying somebody who is a relative first. She's being very proper in the way that she decides to marry someone.
And this is why I think we have trouble in our marriages today, because we don't understand what's happening here.
I mean, who marries somebody for the sake of the good of their parents?
But when you marry someone for the sake of the common good, if your priority is taking care of someone, supporting the community, taking care of your extended family, if that's your framework, you already, in the very first steps of this union, you've already laid the foundation for God to be the center of the household, because that's what God does. He sustains the community. He takes care of all his children. Ruth is acting responsibly here. It's a big deal. And again, she's not a Judahite. "Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence." So again, this is the question of propriety. It's so important to protect her honor, and now he's underscoring that her honor is intact. Her reputation was already exemplary, and he's not going to do anything to jeopardize that. Now, it is true, I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. So now, again, this really undermines this idea of any indication of exploitation, because this guy who has taken care of this woman and provided for her, and who has in the text expressed his admiration for her, is now saying, I may not have a right here. Let me first be correct according to the house rule in the land of Judah, because if there is a closer relative, then no matter what happens, I can't dishonor him or disenfranchise him. It's really important how careful and correct he's being.
Yeah, it seems very consistent in that by saying this, he's not only caring for Ruth, but caring for Naomi as well.
"Remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning."
Redeeming meaning to be the one who has a right to the inheritance, that has the right to possess the inheritance. And that's what they're trying to sort out here. And Boaz, rather than taking what he can, he's waiting to make sure that he is the correct one, who is the actual redeemer here in the situation.
So she lay at his feet until morning, and rose before one could recognize another. And he said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." Again, he is making sure that she has an out. Because if there is another that she should be with, in other words, if it is expedient and correct for the life of the household, the life of the clan, the life of the community, that she be with another, we don't want to do anything to jeopardize her excellent standing, especially because she's still vulnerable in our community.
Yeah, no, if she looks like a whore, then if trying to marry somebody else, she's going to lose the opportunity, and then she's lost her cause.
Again, he said, "Give me the cloak that is on you and hold it." So she held it, and he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her. Then she went into the city. When she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did it go, my daughter?" And she told her all that the man had done for her. She said, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, 'Do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Again, he's fulfilling his duty toward the community, toward the household. And in doing so, he's supporting the widow and the orphan. He is upholding the honor of a woman and a foreigner. He is taking responsibility for the financial duties of Elimelech, even though it's not yet clear that that is truly his duty. It could also be seen as a kind of advanced dowry. Now, you might say, well, then he wants something, but that's not how it functions here. I think because we tend to break everything down in capitalistic terms, we assume that these types of exchanges are somehow motivated by greed or selfishness. But they're not. I mean, this is social welfare under the Torah.
And if we think about this in the broader context of the Bible, in the Septuagint canon, Ruth falls right after the book of Judges. And at the end of the book of Judges, what do we have? We have the problem of the Levite bringing his concubine and the town mistreating her, killing her, raping her to death most probably, and then a war starting as a result. So we have a lack of hospitality to the Levite and to his concubine, and then the concubine is killed as a result. And that's at the end of Judges. Now we have the book of Ruth, where Boaz is correct in every step of the way, how he takes care of the foreigner, he takes care of the widow, he takes care of the orphan, and even gives above and beyond, saying, "I'm not going to let you leave empty-handed." Every major religion places high importance on hospitality. If we don't place enough focus on the theme of hospitality in this book, I think we're going to miss one of the major points. The fact that Boaz is so good about hospitality in the eyes of the ancient world puts him on a level higher than other people, because this is a major action that a human being takes, is the action of hospitality.
Well, Father Paul Tarazi, in his commentary on Genesis, argues, I think convincingly, that ultimately Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed for inhospitality. We tend to think of it in terms of immorality because that is our focus for a number of reasons, cultural and psychological. But in context of Genesis, hospitality with foreigners is a central issue. Then she said, "Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has settled it today." So what you have here are 2 wise elders, Boaz, who's the senior male, and Naomi, who's the wise widow. Boaz acting correctly and giving good counsel that may be at his expense if he misses out on marrying Ruth, because although it's his duty to support her, it's clear that he admires her. And Naomi counseling her daughter how to approach this man in courtship, and also how to act now that the ball is really in the court of Boaz.
Right, and we also know that Boaz is not a young man, because he said, "You didn't go after young men." It's continuing to show the honor of this man. For the man will not rest until he has settled it today. And this
That's
is what
a good point.
And this is what he promised to her, that tomorrow we're going to settle this. And Naomi says he will settle it today. And the fact that he will not rest before he settles the matter, the fact that he promises to her that he's going to settle the matter, underscores again his virtue.
There is nothing like a reliable male authority figure in the community. Just like there's nothing as beautiful as a reliable female authority figure. It's not about gender versus gender. There's something beautiful about Boaz acting correctly, and there's something beautiful about Naomi acting wisely.
One thing beautiful is how she comes and says, "I'm your servant." Ruth says this to Boaz, knowing that he's the powerful elder man in this household. And the first thing he says is, "Don't worry, I'm going to take care of you." She makes herself completely vulnerable to him, and he underscores that he will not violate the trust that she has put in him.
And I cannot stress this last point enough, and it's probably a good place to end this episode today, Richard. We are not talking about ontology in Scripture. We are always talking about function. It's about modes of behavior, which means that it is possible for a human being to act from a position of strength and function in a godly manner, so long as the strength is coming from God's commandment and the authority exercised is the authority of the commandment. And Boaz doesn't do anything in chapter 2 or 3 that isn't governed by the way God has instructed him to act.
Taking care of the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan.
This is so hard for people to understand, but this was key for the Pauline school in the New Testament, because they looked at the Roman household and they said, look, the Roman household works because the Romans are tribal and they understand the function of authority and power. We just have to transfer that authority from the ego of the paterfamilias to the commandment of God. But in order for the household to function, the paterfamilias still needs to be a paterfamilias. This, I think, will always make it difficult for modern readers who accept the ontological categories of good and bad, the ontological categories of gender or identity. When you're stuck in that philosophical quagmire, you'll never understand how a fallen human being can manifest the presence of the Almighty God, even though he's a fallen human being. I don't know how else to say it, Richard. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
You've just heard the Bible as literature. Thanks for listening.
The Bible as Literature is a production of the Ephesus School Network.
Hi, this is Father Mark Boulos with the Bible as Literature podcast. What if someone wrote a book that imposed patriarchal authority at the expense of patriarchs, redeemed inheritance at the expense of wealth, upheld a patronymic without blessing the name, linked patrimony and childbirth to each other and to God's teaching, while emphasizing the commandment to care for the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner? Rubbed in the fact that God blesses couples, households, and communities that by all rights should not be blessed, and finally, presented a vision of some future kingdom that will include the very people that everyone is trying to avoid. You don't have to ask what if. We have the book in hand and will cover its final chapter today. Richard and I discuss Ruth, chapter 4.
You're listening to the Bible as literature.
Hi, this is Father Mark Boulos.
And this is Dr. Richard Benton.
And you are listening to episode 92 of the Bible as Literature podcast. I want all of you to try to imagine what it would be like to sit down for a cup of tea in a cafe in Syria. I was going to say Lebanon, but let's tip our hats to the Syrians today, to discuss matters of land, property, inheritance, and title. These are very serious matters for Semitic cultures. In the ancient world, discussions about property, discussions about relationships are interlinked and pertain to social welfare. And so we begin Ruth chapter 4 in the smoke-filled back room of the tent somewhere in Bethlehem, where they are sitting down to discuss what to do about all this wealth that needs to be redeemed for the sake of the community. That's what this is about. And so I'll let Richard describe how, yet again, Boaz is taking the high road in this negotiation.
Right. What happens in the ancient Near East is that whenever a man has property, it's then passed on to his son. So when you have a son, then they are the ones who are able to inherit that property. So they redeem that property upon the death of the father. Now, what happens if the father dies and there is no son? Then you have a problem, because then there's no one who can take over that land. And as a result, the widow is in a difficult position. And that's the precise position of both Naomi and of Ruth, because there are no sons.
The key is that the one who steps forward to redeem Gaal, to redeem the vacant inheritance or the unused inheritance. And it's interesting, the way it works, it's as though the inheritance is like a fetus in the womb of the widow. And so when another man comes along, it then can become a reality again. It can be redeemed by a close relative. But the problem is that the relative who redeems it, which is linked to the redemption of the one who's being activated with the dead relative's wealth, that person runs the risk of forfeiting a second inheritance that's tied to a separate line.
The inheritance lies with the son who, like you said, is like a seed inside the mother. Now, if the husband dies before it's able to be born, so to speak, then someone else has the ability to bring that forth. And so if someone else were to marry that woman, then that first child, that first son, would be raised up as the son of the dead father. Mm-hmm. And so he would bear the name, bear the inheritance of that father.
And that's the key, the name and the inheritance. And this is language that is applied elsewhere in the Bible. It's a big thing because the name carries the reality of the household, and the inheritance is put to work to take care of the people who submit to that name within that household. But the idea is that life continues. Very important.
Right. And technically, anyone could marry that woman, but not anyone has the right to the inheritance right away. The inheritance is supposed to go to the closest relative. You know, we have the levirate marriage, and Jesus even talks about that, where the husband dies, and so the brother marries the widow in order to raise up a son to that person. Mm-hmm. And raising up a son isn't just, they get to carry the name. They have the inheritance. Like you said, the inheritance and the name are associated. So if somebody marries that widow, that first child is actually the son of the dead father, not you, the father, not the new father. So technically, that new father has no son. Technically, that's the son of the dead father. So if the one who marries the widow wants to raise up a son to inherit his own property, he has to have a second son in order to have someone to pass that along to.
I think if we allow ourselves to think of the inheritance as the seed, the zerah, if you don't plant the seed, nothing will be produced. It's very simple. Just think of it on that level. If you don't plant the seed, nothing will be produced. And you have a social responsibility to produce sons and daughters for the land, for the life of the community, and it's linked to the resources that you have. It's completely antithetical to the way we understand capital in an individualistic society. We think of money as being mine, and I can do whatever I want with it when I die. That's not how things work here. And once you understand that, you realize just exactly how loving Boaz is in all of this.
I mean, this is the whole parable that Jesus talks about with the Samaritans. You know, what happens if each one of the brothers dies and the wife has no son, then who is married to that woman? Who is the one who is the ultimate husband of that person? It gets confusing because the son belongs only to that first father.
But Jesus' point is very interesting. He's saying, look, who cares about the inheritance? You're thinking about the wrong inheritance. I'm talking about inheriting the kingdom of God, and you're worried about where the money goes. So in that example that you give, things are turned upside down because they're arguing about who is whose wife, not because they're worried about the marriage bed. They're worried about the money. And this is a betrayal of what Boaz is upholding here. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. Again, he brings out his tea and some candies and says, "Let's talk." They're going to do business now. This is the equivalent of the smoke-filled room.
And one thing to note is we have translated here, again, close relative, and this is the one who redeems. And the one who redeems is the one who has the ability to raise up children to this other father.
So these are two men who have the potential to actually be men and produce a household or support a household.
To the late husband of Ruth.
So they're essentially sitting down to discuss who's going to take up this mantle and this responsibility. He took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down.
This is where the real business begins, because he wants witnesses.
Now they've got witnesses. Then he said to the closest relative, "Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you." And he said, "I will redeem it."
This new relative, who's a closer relative to Naomi than Boaz, says, yeah, I'll have the land, I'll buy the land, and then I'll take over the inheritance, and I'll make sure I take care of the widow Naomi. I'll buy it from her so she has some way of taking care of herself from the land.
It's also important to note here that Boaz began by talking strictly about the land. You can feel that he is being very tactical, not deceptive, but tactical. There's this benefit, you get this inheritance. And the guy initially is interested. So now we know you want to buy the field. We've established that. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, guess what? You must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance." Now, again, addressing this question of whether or not Boaz is being selfish here. Technically, if he wanted to control the deal so that he could get what he wanted up front, he wouldn't have presented the deal in an attractive way, because it's actually Ruth that brings the deal down, because that's what jeopardizes your primary inheritance through another son. It's like an investment, like you can get this money, but then you lose half of it in taxes. That's the idea. This is taxes and tribute in a tribal setting.
It's already questionable to say you have to marry this woman. That goes along with it. But say, oh, by the way, this woman is a foreigner and a Moabitess, and naturally these people are looked down upon. Marrying them is very questionable. In the Torah, it talks about how no Moabite is allowed into the congregation to the seventh generation. We know that there's this prohibition against marrying foreign wives. This is a big catch.
It's so interesting to see how the negotiation is going, and to see this potential burden that Boaz is positioning himself to take up. Given all these facts, the closest relative said, "I cannot redeem it for myself because I would jeopardize my own inheritance." Redeem it for yourself. You may have the right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. In other words, it's not worth it for me to take on the responsibility of a Moabitess, and in doing so to jeopardize my initial inheritance through another line. I won't do it. I'm not going to mess around with that.
Right. The first son that he would have would be for Ruth's husband. It wouldn't be for himself, and so he would jeopardize his own, because he would have to then have a son of his own to raise up as the inheritor of his own property.
Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption and the exchange of land to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another, and this was the manner of attestation in Israel. So the closest relative said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Kilion and Mahlon. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today." So he's saying, look, we have this beautiful woman, Naomi. Let's redeem the line of Elimelech through her womb. Let's redeem the inheritance. I'm going to be responsible, and I say it before all the elders, and you're all witnesses. All the people who were in the court and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel, and may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. They are adopting the Moabitess. They are integrating the story of Boaz and Ruth into this narrative. It's an anamnesis by remembering all of these characters in the Bible and applying the blessing of their story to this couple. You are adopting Ruth, but also sealing the marriage.
I think it's peculiar that the example they bring up, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because Tamar's husband died, and Judah wouldn't give his other son to marry Tamar because he was afraid she was bad luck. So Judah withheld his son to bear up children to her husband. And what happened is Tamar had to fool Judah, pretending to be a prostitute, and Judah went into Tamar himself, thinking she was a prostitute, to bear children. So I think it's an interesting paradigm that Tamar, the foreigner who was brought into Judah by subterfuge, and who eventually bore Perez being the forefather of Boaz. Some really interesting stories that are woven in here that we don't have time to go in today.
So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. And here, I think it's important that the Lord enabled her to conceive, because I think people will take verse 13 and say, oh, well, did they have sex earlier in chapter 3, or did they have sex here? But we're not concerned with sex in verse 13. We're concerned with fruitfulness. And I think the Lord giving them a child is confirmation of the fruitfulness of God's commandment at work in Boaz for the community. Because the seed of Boaz, which is the seed of the instruction that animates him, already produced life. And so even the birth of a son in the womb of Ruth is simply an anamnesis or a confirmation of what was already happening in the household, because God's instruction was heeded. So again, people who are interested in the Davidic line will fixate on verse 13 and say, they had a baby. No, the pregnancy took place the minute Boaz was obedient in the land to the instruction of the Lord. Then the woman said to Naomi, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. Notice here you would expect her to say, thank God the name of Elimelech is not forgotten. But what does that name mean? It means my God is king. Who is the father whom Naomi is praising? She's not praising Boaz. She's not praising the name of Elimelech, which technically is restored in this marriage. She is praising the name of the Lord, that his name may become famous in Israel. That is why this story is beautiful. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. The neighbor woman gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they called him Obed, which means
servant.
Abd in Arabic, Obed in Hebrew, the servant. This whole story has been about submission, and they produced a child whose name means submission. Submission to God's teaching in the household of Israel, in the land, in the household of Judah, which should reflect God's eschatological kingdom. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron, and to Hezron was born Ram, and to Ram Amminadab, and to Amminadab was born Nahshon, and to Nahshon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz, and to Boaz Obed, and to Obed was born Jesse, and to Jesse David. Now, what's powerful here is that you have this image of the covenant being restored by a faithful servant of the Torah, taking care of the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan. And this creates a context in which the womb of God's people, in receiving his instruction, bears fruit unto life. And the author of Ruth is saying this is the vision for what the Davidic kingdom should be. Now, whether it becomes that is another matter. But it's striking, as you've pointed out again and again throughout this series, that there are all these rules about the purity of the line.
Right, you're not allowed to have a Moabite unto the 7th generation.
But yet, God is establishing the line of David by polluting it. That's why I think pointing out the imperfection of the Old Testament characters that were mentioned, Rachel, Leah, Tamar, and so forth.
These are the generations of Perez in verse 18. Perez, for some reason, the son of the prostitute and the unfaithful father, is the one who establishes the line. And then you get the good Moabitess who continues the line and pollutes it at the same time, in spite of what her husband, who is the hospitable one, who is the kind one, who looks out for the outsider, for the widow, for the orphan. So there's a tension where it's polluted yet purified at the same time.
Because you think you're better than the Moabites, but you're not. Yet God has blessed you. I want to say this again. You think you're better than the others, and you're not better in a very glamorous, painful way. Yet God extends his blessing to you. Because if that were not the case, God would have dumped Jacob, Israel. Because Jacob was a treacherous person. He did ruthlessly plot with his mother to steal from his brother. He betrayed and lied to his father. Yet God kept his oath and took care of him. God didn't remove his care from them, even though Esau was the one who was defrauded. This is meant to undo the sense of entitlement and xenophobia and elitist tribal thinking that is the negative aspect of having these communities that are so self-supporting and so tightly knit. So it's beautiful, it's painful, and it's the story of the Bible. Thanks very much, Dr. Benson.
Thank you, Father.
You've just heard the Bible